Peter Golder, welcome to Knowledge and Practice. Thanks so much for being here. Today we're talking about your new elective called Creating Winning New Products and Services, which is part of the marketing curriculum offered at Tuck. To start off, I want to read an excerpt from your syllabus that succinctly describes what this course is all about. So here it goes. Quote, this course teaches a process for identifying market opportunities, creating new product or service ideas, and turning those ideas into valuable new products and services. We focus on the tools and techniques for analyzing market opportunities, creating creative thinking for generating new ideas, and then designing, testing, and launching new products and services. So before we dive into the specifics of your course, can you talk a little about the importance of developing new products and services both for firms and the economy in general?
Sure, happy to. So first off, thanks for interest in the course, and thanks for having me today. So new products. I mean, it's been my area of research for a long time. It's super fun to study because it basically transforms the way we live our lives on a daily basis. So you go back to just things people have in the households, just like washing machines and dishwashers. Really are transformative, especially like washing machine. I mean, it transformed the life of the household for women in particular when it came out. I remember talking to my grandmother who grew up in her home before she had a washing machine, and what that was like. So really transformative in her life. As we think forward to more recent innovations, of course, our mobile phones have transformed life in a large way, but over time, things like radios and TVs and satellites and all these things really transform the way we go about our daily lives. I think most people would say for the better, not without some unintended consequences, perhaps. But these new products really change the way we live our lives on a daily basis and raise standard of living for people, for companies. They help companies grow, help companies be more profitable, and for individuals, it's a nice path for them too, just to explore these new opportunities, and ends up as a way that that successful entrepreneurs become rich in the process.
Yeah, yeah. Well, new products are always exciting for consumers. I know that everyone's looking forward to something new that's going to come out. Oftentimes we'll find things that we didn't know we needed, right? And those tend to be sometimes some of the best things, right?
Sure. So I know you ride bikes a fair amount. So think back from going from steel frame to aluminum frame to carbon frame, and what that means just for biking, and aside from all the other technology that goes along with it. When you think back to 150 years ago, people riding on a bike and like this giant front wheel and a tiny back wheel, and it's hard to imagine that would be like bicycle technology, and how much just that has changed over time, and every aspect of it has really changed over time, from the materials to the braking technology and the gears, and all those things have changed. So even within the context of like a bicycle as a category, it's changed tremendously over time.
Yeah, yeah. The bicycle category, especially, much to my chagrin, changes very quickly,
Yeah.
causing me to want to upgrade constantly.
Yes.
So in that excerpt of your syllabus that I read, I noticed that you italicized and underlined the word process. So clearly that's an important word in this context. Why did you decide to teach this material of this course through the vehicle of a process?
Sure. So there are many reasons. I'd say one of the main reasons I really want to break this notion that innovation is lucky or serendipitous, and there are even some textbooks that talk about this, that's serendipity. I'm kind of a mind that luck is the result of persistence as much as anything, and that it's this process that gets us to the insights, and I think that they are not at all lucky when you deconstruct it. And when you look at kind of the process of innovation, it might seem sort of discontinuous and sort of random from the outside, but it is a much more kind of continuous process in terms of things being developed. So the process is important to me because I want to break this notion of innovation being considered just a matter of luck. therefore a process is something that you can replicate. And once you learn it in one context, which is what we do in the course, we apply it in one context within the course, then you can replicate this in other aspects of your life. And really this process has been in place for decades, I would say. People get better at parts of it, but the process is going to be able to stick with the students for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, so as consumers, most of us exist at the tail end of the new product process, right? And we don't get to see how everything unfolded before that new item appears on the shelf. Can you pick a popular product or service and tell us how it came to be?
Sure, that's a great question, and happy to. So, as I've said, I've researched these innovations for a long time, and I think you talk about consumers coming at this at kind of the end of the process, and the end of the process is really much longer than people think. So just I'll go into detail in one example in a moment, but just some examples from my research. Things like fax machine were existing in the consumer marketplace, being used back in the 60s, and you probably think I'm talking about 1960s, but it's the 1860s.
Really?
For like fax machines. There were early let's see the next one here. There were early like auto navigation systems that existed in the early part of the 20th century. They weren't GPS. But they existed through through other technologies. So these things exist for a long time, really, before consumers see them. Sometimes they exist in the laboratory, sometimes they exist in the marketplace in very primitive forms. So one of the things we think about a lot today would be our mobile phones, our cell phones, of course. So part of the history of that I've talked about in my research is as a concept, I mean, people knew about communication technologies for a long time. So before telephone, there was telegraph, and there were other ways to communicate at distance but before that. But so that kind of technology goes back to the the early parts of the 1800s. Then of course you have the telephone, in the latter part of that century, and it wasn't just Alexander Graham Bell who was involved in that development. But then when you think about mobile phones in particular, so mobile phones really kind of started to leverage like radio technology to be able to communicate at distance. So you'd have things like people would have car phones, but they'd have car phones that would be using radio frequencies instead of cell technology. So some of the early concepts for mobile phones, Bell Labs was doing this in the 1940s. There were patents on cellular technology. So cellular technology is still using the radio waves, but you're breaking up into discrete cells, which allows kind of the same frequency to be used by more than one call, by multiple calls. So you have patents developed around that in the 70s. You have prototypes, coming along in the 60s. And basically, when this finally hits consumers kind of in the 80s, when sort of these cell licenses start to be distributed in the early 80s, this technology's really been around in some form for decades. And so consumers are really seeing this at the tail end of a very long process. And of course, those are just the early cell phones. Those are the bricks that we see on the TV shows from the 1980s that people have to hold with two hands. But where does the technology go from there? Part of that I can trace through things like the MP3 players, right, where you start to develop things that's not it's not the phone, but you're still developing things like you're seeing manifestations of like file compression technology that come through MP3 players, but then that file compression technology can be traced back to the 40s with some of the original ideas, 50s, 60s, 70s with some of the early parts of that. So file compression didn't start with the first Apple iPod that comes out. That idea is out there for a long time. And as you move forward towards the iPhone, what's unique about the iPhone? In a lot of ways, the iPhone combined technologies that existed for a while, but obviously did it in a very elegant way. But the underlying technologies, like a file compression that went into some of it, had been around for a long time. Even things like touchscreens had been around for a long time. So I don't know about you. The first touchscreen I used was in around 1988.
Really? Wow, that's early.
But then that technology existed before. So this idea that the touchscreen wasn't invented with the iPhone. It had been around in forms before that. And even Steve Jobs himself would say that creativity is a lot about connecting things. And he's not the only person to say that, but many people have thought that. So especially for these commercialized technologies, a lot of it is about taking ideas that have existed in some form and putting them together. Tim Berners-Lee, the person associated with the advent of World Wide Web, also talks a lot about that, about pulling different technologies together and putting them into something that is, really unique when you put them all together. But you're not starting from scratch. You're really building on the work of others. And so I think for entrepreneurs, it's important to think about sort of what already exists in the marketplace. And the opportunity to be successful with a radical innovation means that you're not creating something brand new. You're probably putting pieces together that have existed for a long time in a way that no one has really done before.
Wow, that's so interesting. I never really thought about new products that way, that they combine all these pieces of technologies that had already existed for decades and for a long time.
Sure, so I'll jump in again. So another example is fundamental technologies like lasers.
Mm-hmm.
Like lasers were invented in the lab, but then found their way into a whole variety of different technologies. So just like CD players would be one of these. And so you think like, the laser wasn't invented to develop a CD player necessarily, but that technology eventually found its way into that format. And so sometimes you see these innovations come along because there is a technology that can meet an underlying need. So a lot of radical innovations really center around figuring out better ways to transport us.
Mm-hmm.
Automobiles,
Mm-hmm.
airplanes, jet engines, things like that. A lot of radical innovations center around helping people communicate better. That's kind of what we just talked about, going from shouting at a distance to, telegraph to telephone to mobile phones, things like that, or entertainment. And so you think about radio to TV as a form of not just communication, but entertainment, movies, talking movies at one point. And so technology has developed through that, so they're basically, satisfying an underlying need that exists for a long time, but you're just using technology to do that in better and better ways. And one of the things, again, going back to like our mobile phones, you're really kind of merging the communication need and the entertainment need and packaging that in one device. Whereas previously, our kind of communication and entertainment needs, historically would have been somewhat more sort of separated, and merging those together is one of the reasons that's kind of the blockbuster innovation that it's been.
Wow. So let's take the reality of that process and think about it in the context of your course then. How do you convey that and teach that to your students?
Sure. So it comes down to this process again. So, there is this process, and this is a process that's not unique to me. Aspects of it and the way I teach it might be more unique, but essentially, the 5-stage process is you identify an opportunity, and that space can be fairly broad. Second stage is you generate ideas. Generally, you're trying to generate a lot of ideas. I'm a big proponent of, you're going to find the diamond through a lot of carbon dust along with it. And not just that. It's not that you're going to find one good idea, 99 bad ideas, but those bad ideas are often the stepping stones to a good idea, where you take pieces of those bad ideas that help you, you can incorporate some aspects of those. So anyway, so volume is really good at the idea generation stage. Then you move on to concept development, a prototype, and then your market launch in the fifth stage. So those are the 5 stages, and it's really important to for the students to understand that process, but then get into the details of each part of that process as well during the course.
I thought it would be fun to focus on one aspect of your course, which is the creative process. For people who don't think a lot about creativity, the act of being creative seems like something that just springs forth from our minds, and there's not much rhyme or reason to it. But one of your class sessions is called Creative Thinking Techniques for Idea Generation. So there must be some specific ways to foster creativity, which I think is so interesting. Can you tell us about some of these ways that you like to think about creativity and how to foster it?
Sure, happy to. So it's one of the fun parts of the course, really. I mean, there are lots of fun parts of the course, but this is one of them. And it does surprise people to think of creativity as a process rather than just, again, this kind of lucky outcome that happens. But essentially, to think about this conceptually, the way I think about this is you really want to think about how to move your thought to unexpected places. So we are kind of, a lot of people are sort of hardwired to think in more linear processes. That's typically how we're efficient, right? So throughout our lives, we get paid to be efficient at something. And we talk about learning curves and, essentially, learning how to do more in the same amount of time or just do things faster. So, but creativity is, it's not designed for efficiency, so we're not necessarily good at it, but you want to take the thought and move it kind of sideways rather than move it forward, because that helps you kind of explore a different space. So what are some ways to kind of move your thought sideways? So, we go through these with illustrations in the class, but one of the ways that kind of more intuitive to grasp is just using like a random word or random object association. So if you take a bunch of random, take a random object, any random object, say that there's a fan sitting over there, and then you think about all of the attributes of that fan, both how it looks, how it performs, all the sort of characteristics of that. And then you can take all those characteristics and you map those back to your kind of focal area. So you think, I want to innovate in this space that has something to do with like, a new form of communication or something. And you say, what does a fan have to do with communication? And, perhaps nothing. But if you come up with, 100 associations for a fan, just in terms of the parts that it's made of, where it operates, when it operates, the basic things that it does. So you come up with these 100 associations, and then you have all these random associations to do with a fan. So it's not just about mapping a fan, but it's these 100 other things that you associate with a fan back to this focal area where you're trying to innovate. And essentially your thought is moving, sideways in that way, and without a particular destination in mind, but that's what you're trying to do with creativity. So that random object is one thing. Another thing that's is to think about the assumptions that exist in industries. And so every industry is built on a certain set of assumptions. And one of the ways you can be innovative in industry is to take those assumptions and then either remove those assumptions or reverse those assumptions. And some examples of this would be, if you think about this in transportation. So again, I'm going back to transportation as one of the kind of core areas of invention. And you think about how people use like short-term transportation. You think about a classic rental car situation. So what do you do in a rental car? What are the norms in traditional rental car? I mean, it's gotten more automated over time, but traditional rental car, you go to the store, you go to the rental office, you stand in line, you fill out some paperwork, and finally they give you your car. So if we take those assumptions of the industry, well, what happens if we take away those assumptions? What happens if I don't have to go to the office and I don't have to fill out a bunch of paperwork? And then something like that becomes manifested in something like Zipcar. where the car is essentially there for you, and the technology kind of takes care of all those other parts. Now you think about that. So Zipcar was reasonably successful, I would say, as a operation. Certainly as an entrepreneurial venture, it made some people wealthy. But you think about transportation again, and you think about things like taxis. So what are all the assumptions in taxis, right? It's like I have to go find the taxi. I typically am going to have to pay in cash, right? There'll be a cash transaction there, and you think about all the assumptions that go along with that, and then you start to take away some of those assumptions. You don't have to pay with cash. The car will find you instead of you finding the car, and I mean, everyone knows now I'm talking about Uber and Lyft and services like that, and those aren't the only ride services out there, but certainly, in terms of being financially successful and really kind of transforming the way a lot of people live, I mean, you're basically just, taking these assumptions that everyone else took for granted and saying we're gonna remove these.
Yeah.
And then you figure out a way to remove them. But the first thing is to break the idea, is to break this notion that we have to accept these as just the way things work.
Yeah.
And when you break those assumptions, you don't necessarily know how you're going to fix them, but it at least starts you on a path then to fixing them.
Right, right. No, that's really interesting, because actually it makes me think about the sort of the research process that you undertake a lot, which is questioning conventional wisdom, right? I mean, a lot of your research has been looking back on research that has been done and saying, maybe that's not the way it really worked. Right, and so that must kind of have some synergies with you in this course and thinking about new products. Does it also kind of connect with how you do research?
It does.
Yeah.
This idea of reversal is important because when I think about my research, there's two main ways it goes. One is sort of taking a bunch of phenomena that are unstructured and trying to put some structure around it. The other way is more the one that you're suggesting. The other approach I've used is to look at things that people do accept as being somewhat conventional wisdom, and then looking into those, and I mean, I almost asked myself at the beginning, it's like, what if this wasn't true? And then sometimes when you look at it closer, it turns out, yeah, it's not so true. So this is related to the first mover literature that you're referring to, which was pretty much accepted as conventional wisdom, that first movers are successful, and it turns out that they're not. It's just the surviving first movers are, can be reasonably successful, but a lot of them failed before you got to the survivors, and we go back to this innovation path. I mean, the people who were selling fax machines in the 1860s were, not becoming the next Bell telephone company. Although, Western, I mean, more on the telegraph side, Western Union certainly, established itself, pretty well for a long time in that business. The early people selling auto navigation systems in the early 1900s, didn't create a financial empire. So that sense that it just, takes a long time is also really wasn't that well, documented in the literature either. So, yeah, it's fun to dig into the history of innovation and come up with something that people really haven't thought about as much before.
Yeah. When you're talking about the assumptions that you kind of want to take away in this creative process, I couldn't help but think that those assumptions were also kind of inconvenient things about the product.
Yeah.
That needed to be changed or that should have been changed. Is that sort of just a coincidence, or do you think that's sort of part of the process, that like the assumption is also a problem?
It can be a problem, and certainly solving it a different way can create some benefits. So another example of this would be like Netflix, or at least Netflix in its first form, really removed some conventions, right? Because I don't know about you, but I mean, I went to Blockbuster, the local video store, and that was normal, right? You would go, they'd have a limited selection, but you would go and pick something that was on the shelf. And but what are the assumptions there? It's like the assumption is the customer is going to go to the store and selection is going to be limited. You're going to pick the best that's available. And Netflix really reversed those and saying essentially, again, this is still Netflix, kind of the early version, the mail version. And but the store came to you instead of you go to the store, and selection was pretty unlimited. But the your question is really getting me this idea also of like pain points. So, which is another way to just to think about innovation. It's a little more of a straightforward route to innovation, I would say, but they often are related because an assumption is really often a suboptimal solution.
Mm.
And even if it's not an explicit pain point, accepting that assumption is usually leading to some type of suboptimization. And relaxing that assumption at least gets you to the possibility where you can move someplace else. And again, this is mentally move someplace else. And it's like, imagine, you're imagining the world in a different way and then figuring out if you can actually create that. And part of this creative thinking, it's not necessarily going to lead to the next billion-dollar company, but you can at least imagine a world where it might be possible. And then you think about, well, is there technology really to make this happen? Because those two have to go together because, Netflix, especially the later version, the more streaming version of Netflix, needed some technology. Uber needed some underlying technology. A really meaningful auto navigation system, is a lot better with GPS than figuring out just, going through inertia and trying to figure out how, how the car is moving, mechanically to try and figure out where it is. So, the technology definitely underlies this, but by reversing these assumptions, you can at least get yourself to a place where you can think, well, what's possible now, and is this possible?
Yeah, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but if people want to read more about the creative process and how to go about that, do you have like a favorite book or resource?
I think a lot of what I do in the class is really pulled together from a variety of places. I mean, I have a whole library of like books on creativity in my office. You're making me think I need to write a book.
Maybe you do, yeah.
So maybe that's my creative idea for the session.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Which I have to thank you for, yes.
So under the heading of creative process, you have the students do an individual project where they choose a creative genius to study. So tell us a creative genius that you admire and how you organize your own creative process.
I mean, I think there are so many who I would admire, and I would say, one of the things that I want the students to do in the class and allow them to do is to move into any area that they want to study. So this could be somebody from the realm of art or music or literature. Doesn't need to be science, doesn't need to be technology, doesn't need to be business, but can be any kind of creative endeavor. So that's really important to me. So I think there are many answers to that question. I think one that comes to mind now is just Leonardo da Vinci. And the reason why I would pick him is because he was really involved in so many different aspects of kind of innovation and creative thinking, and from art to science, and really kind of and I think the reason that's important to me is one of the things I talk about in the class, and is just kind of different ways of thinking and different styles of thinking. And how we shouldn't limit ourselves in terms of how we think, even if we have tendencies to think in certain ways, that we can develop other skills. So just like creativity, I make sports analogies in class, right? So I mean, if you're right-handed, I mean, you're still going to work on your left in practice, right? You want that left-handed dribble to be just as good as a right-handed dribble, and in terms of thinking, I'm a big believer that that we have kind of natural ways of thinking, but that we can develop all the different ways of thinking. And I think Da Vinci is a good example of somebody who really developed a variety of ways of thinking and put those into practice. And I think that's good inspiration for for all of us to think about how we can not only build on our strengths, but develop those aspects that are that maybe aren't as much of our natural tendencies. And this gets back to something we were talking about earlier about creativity and innovation coming through connecting different things. And the more ways that we think differently, the better we are able to do that as individuals, to connect the artistic side of what we're doing, the literature side of what we're doing, to the technology or science side of what we're doing. So I think as individuals we can do that to develop ourselves to fulfill our own potential. But then you also asked about the group part of the project, and this is where the group part comes in. One way is to do this in an innovation project is to do this in groups, because one of the consistent findings in the research literature is that diverse new product teams outperform less diverse new product teams. And it's the reason diversity works in most environments is because we learn more from people with different points of view from us. And that's true in many contexts. For me, I would say all contexts. But there's a lot of research in the innovation literature that really shows these diverse new product teams work, because not only are individuals sort of bringing their whole selves to a project, but people with diverse points of view are bringing their whole selves. And it really links to this overall creative idea, because as a group they're able to move to different mental spaces than any one person would move on their own, and they can bring the group with them over to that mental space, and another person can bring them to another mental space, and essentially you put these different ideas and you make these connections in a way that an individual person would not do as successfully as a diverse team.
Yeah, can you say a little bit more about the objective of the group project in your course?
Sure. So there's several objectives. So I mean, just in general, teamwork is good. I mean, it's one of the things Tuck is known for, I would say, in the recruiting world and the corporate world. So that's certainly building on one of our strengths. The unique aspects here, I would say, in a new product context, is again trying to bring together these diverse viewpoints to see how you can really build on others' ideas and leverage those ideas to come up with a better idea in the end. And then it's also, I think, working together helps reinforce the process that we talked about in the beginning, and that a group does have to work more structured than an individual might work. An individual, I think, would go through a new product exploration somewhat differently, but the fact that it's structured as a team assignment, that overlays a certain part of the structure to them, and the structure then that they lean on is this 5-stage new product development process. So the team nature of the project really reinforces that as the organizing framework by which the whole team does their work. And I certainly want them to come out of the course with that process in mind, because again, they can take that and replicate it in their professional and personal lives. And you just also see the diversity of thought and the different ways that people are creative by having that kind of close group experience as well.
Yeah. Now I don't know if you were dodging my question about the creative process that you like to do, or if you just forgot. But I really want to hear your own, like, I guess your creative habits, your creative, your process.
Sure. So I do think it's important to think about. So like you said, the assignment really asks students not, the starting point is to identify another creative genius and to think about what their creative process is. That's great, but that's not as relevant as the next couple steps. The next step is then to think about the different creative processes that we talk about in the class, and then finally think about how this relates to your own creative process. So ultimately, that's what I want them to focus on. That's really the essence of it, because frankly, ChatGPT would write a good report on Da Vinci's creative process, and that's okay as a starting point, but that doesn't internalize it for each individual. So it's a matter of sort of internalizing it. So for me, again, not to get to the question finally, I think about sort of, I do like this reversal idea, the sense of like provocation, about testing ideas and thinking about the opposite of something. And, that can lead to, it's not going to be fruitful every time you take that path. More often than not, it's going to be a dead end. But the times when it's not is pretty exciting, because you're finding something new and essentially reversing conventional wisdom. So that is pretty exciting to be able to do that, and it's worth the dead ends, because you figure out the dead ends pretty quickly, and you invest in the paths that actually have some successful outcomes. I also think it's important to think about sort of what activities or times of day are important for thinking. So for me, things like running, bicycling would be good chances to think, because I think the thought process there is a little bit less structured, because the thought can kind of go in different places, and you're sort of thinking about one thing that happened last week, and then all of a sudden there's this thing you see off over here. So your thought is kind of moving in a more fluid way when you're in an activity like that. For me personally, I do I do enjoy thinking at those times. I also find I do a lot of good thinking early in the morning, like when I wake up. That's a good time for me to think. So maybe this is just my excuse for staying in bed, but sometimes if I'm on a good path, I will stay there and keep thinking. And I've sort of in mentally written papers during that time, and I think that's a time where my thought has I feel like my thought can be moving in different spaces at that point, and I'm able to kind of pull things together. But that thought of mental exploration is really important. It's one of the things I like about the course. It's one of the things I like about being able to do research, and seeing the students kind of put their thoughts and energies into different spaces and coming up with new ideas is very exciting to be able to participate in that process with them.
Yeah. I want to go back for a second to what you were saying about Da Vinci and how he kind of brings these different ways of thinking together and brings them to bear on his creations. It kind of reminds me of that early Apple slogan, "Think different," right?
Mm-hmm.
When I think about thinking differently, I'm like, well, what does that mean to think differently? Because I think the way I think, and I don't know another way to think, right? Like, what are some ways we can think differently from from our usual thought patterns? Is there a way you can talk about that?
Sure, I definitely think there are things we talk about. So we touched on earlier this idea of just identifying norms and assumptions in an industry, and really just either taking those away. So you either remove those, or you reverse those. There's another technique we talk about in class that's just about idea of substituting or enlarging or adapting. You think about innovation in this isn't the greatest form of innovation perhaps, but you think about Oreo cookies, right? So for many decades, an Oreo cookie was an Oreo cookie, and basically starting, I think it was in the 1970s when they started with double stuff, they essentially started an innovation strategy that they continue to use today, which is basically either you make the cookie or the filling greater or lesser. You change the flavoring. So basically they're adapting, modifying, enlarging, shrinking different aspects of it, and that's been kind of their innovation strategy for a long time. So there are things like that just kind of get you to move in a different direction. But I do think these things that have to do with reversing, taking away assumptions, reversing conventional norms, and just again allowing the thought to go there. It's not going to get you to someplace all the time. It's going to get you someplace, not necessarily someplace useful. Which is the other thing, I guess, about innovation. It's like there's creativity and there's innovation. Innovation has to sort of have both creative and useful, I think, as an important part of it. But the creativity part of it is a necessary part of it. So you can't have innovation without some measure of creativity, and it's okay to have a lot of failures in that creative part of the process to get to the successful parts of it. The other thing we talked about was like making connections. And this is something you can do in daily life, just walking around a store or taking a walk in the neighborhood. You can pick any two random objects and think about how those two objects are connected, right? Like, how is that pen connected to that microphone? You could either say, they're not really connected, or you could spend the next, 10 minutes thinking about the 100 ways that they're connected. And you could come up with 100 ways in which they're connected. And so that idea of connecting things is a skill that can work more generally. But I do think all these steps of both reversing things, escaping, just this idea of like wishful thinking can be important. I think Da Vinci had a lot of wishful thinking, right? Who's thinking about like flying vehicles and stuff like that. But still, you see a bird. I mean, how many millennia ago did the first person see a bird and say, "Wouldn't it be cool if I could fly?" That's like wishful thinking, and it doesn't develop into the Wright brothers overnight. But I mean, you can have that idea long before you have the technology that can fulfill that idea. So I think just this idea of wishful thinking, canceling, negating, denying, removing assumptions, reversing assumptions and industry norms. These are all things that move us to different places that we wouldn't get if we just went with a more sort of linear way of thinking.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'm going to walk around now with the whole new sense of the world. So thank you, Peter.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No, it's been great to talk with you. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I think our listeners are really going to enjoy thinking more about their creative process. So thanks again.
Okay. My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Kirk.